It killed people, not in battle, not through war, by proximity. The Bible describes men dropping dead simply for touching it, an entire Philistine city breaking out in tumors after it was brought within their walls. 70 men of Beth Shemesh struck down for looking inside it. A man named Uzzah reaching out to steady it when the oxen stumbled, a reflex, an instinct, the kind of thing any person would do to prevent something precious from falling and dying instantly. Struck down by God on the spot, so suddenly and so seemingly unjustly that the Bible records King David himself becoming angry at God for what happened. This was not a religious relic in the soft decorative sense that the word relic has come to carry. This was something that the people who were closest to it treated with the kind of caution you would extend to a live weapon, something that could not be touched, could not be looked at directly, could not be approached by anyone except one specific person, the high priest of Israel, on one specific day of the year, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and even then only after an elaborate series of purifications, and even then only behind a thick veil of incense smoke, because direct visual contact with what was on top of the ark was apparently enough to kill. What was the Ark of the Covenant? That question has occupied kings and scholars and adventurers and archaeologists and theologians for 3,000 years. It has been called the throne of God, the footstool of God, the physical location of the divine presence on earth, a weapon of war so powerful that armies carrying it into battle became nearly unstoppable, a communication device through which God spoke directly to the high priest, a technology so advanced that the people who built it did not fully understand what they had built. And it has been called by the most sober and careful historians of ancient Israel something even stranger than all of those things. Something that the biblical text, read carefully and without the filter of 2,000 years of religious interpretation, actually suggests. And whatever it was, wherever it is now, its disappearance from history is one of the great unsolved mysteries of the ancient world, because the Ark of the Covenant vanished completely without explanation. At some point in the history of ancient Israel, the single most sacred object in the Jewish religious tradition, the object that had led the Israelites through the desert, that had parted the Jordan River, that had brought down the walls of Jericho, that had sat at the center of the temple in Jerusalem for centuries, simply ceased to be mentioned. No account of its destruction, no account of its capture, no account of anyone moving it or hiding it or deciding what to do with it. It is there in the narrative, and then it is not. And where it went is a question that has never been answered. Today we are going to try. Welcome to Sacred Mysteries, where ancient secrets meet modern questions. To understand the mystery of the Ark, you first have to understand what the Bible actually says it was. And the biblical description, read carefully, is one of the most extraordinary passages in the entire Hebrew text. The instructions for building the Ark appear in Exodus chapter 25, when God speaks to Moses on Mount Sinai and provides detailed specifications for what is to be built. The ark itself, the Aaron in Hebrew, was a box, approximately 2.5 cubits long, 1.5 cubits wide, and 1.5 cubits tall. A cubit is roughly 18 inches, so the ark was approximately 3 feet 9 inches long, 2 feet 3 inches wide, and 2 feet 3 inches tall. It was to be made of acacia wood and overlaid inside and out with pure gold. Around its top edge was a gold molding. 4 gold rings were attached to its 4 feet, 2 on each side, through which 2 poles of gold overlaid acacia wood were inserted for carrying. And here the instructions contain a detail that is easy to overlook, but that becomes important later. The poles were never to be removed from the rings. The ark was always to be carried by its poles, never touched directly, always in a state of readiness for movement. On top of the ark was placed what the text calls the capparet, usually translated as the mercy seat or the atonement cover. This was a slab of pure gold, the same dimensions as the top of the ark, with 2 figures called cherubim hammered out of gold at each end, their wings spread upward, their faces turned toward each other and toward the center of the capparet. And the text then says something that is when you read it without the softening filter of religious familiarity, almost shockingly direct. God says to Moses, "There I will meet with you, and from above the mercy seat, from between the two cherubim that are on the ark of the testimony, I will speak with you about all that I will give you in commandment for the people of Israel. There I will meet with you from between the two cherubim." God is not speaking from heaven in this passage. God is not speaking from a burning bush or from a cloud on a mountaintop. God is speaking from a specific location from between the two golden figures on top of a gold-covered wooden box. The ark is not a symbol of divine presence. It is, in the text's own terms, the location of divine presence, the actual place where God is, the actual place where God speaks. And into the ark itself, into the box, under the mercy seat, were placed the two tablets of stone on which God had written the 10 Commandments with his own finger. The ark was the container for the words of God, written by God, and the throne from which God spoke those words. It was the most concentrated intersection of the divine and the physical that the Bible describes. And it could kill. The killing capacity of the ark is one of the most troubling and most consistently avoided aspects of the biblical text. The events around the ark form a pattern that is deeply strange if you approach them with the theological assumption that the ark is simply a sacred object whose holiness demands reverence. The men of Beth Shemesh, 70 of them, are struck dead for looking inside the ark when it is returned by the Philistines. The Hebrew text of 1 Samuel chapter 6 says the Lord struck them down because they looked upon the ark of the Lord. The number 70 appears in all major manuscript traditions, though some manuscripts read 50,070, a number so large that most scholars consider it a textual error. But even 70 is a massacre by any standard. 70 people killed for looking into a box. The episode of Uzzah is, if anything, more disturbing because of its apparent arbitrariness. 2 Samuel chapter 6 describes David bringing the ark to Jerusalem. It is being transported on a new cart, not on poles on the shoulders of the Levites, as specified in the Exodus instructions, but on a cart pulled by oxen. When the oxen stumble, Uzzah reaches out and takes hold of the ark to steady it. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and God struck him down there because of his error, and he died there beside the ark of God. David's anger and fear at this event is recorded explicitly. And David was afraid of the Lord that day, and he said, "How can the ark of the Lord come to me?" David, who had led armies, who had killed Goliath, who had faced Saul's persecution for years, was afraid. Afraid in a way that made him unwilling to bring the ark into his city. The ark was left in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite for 3 months, and the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all his household, so the ark could bless as well as kill. The same object, depending on who was in contact with it, under what circumstances, following what procedures. This is not the behavior of a religious symbol. This is the behavior of something that has properties, something that does things, that produces effects, that operates according to rules that not everyone understands, and that violating carries fatal consequences. The ark's military capabilities are, in the biblical narrative, equally extraordinary. When the Israelites carry the ark in front of their army into battle, they almost always win. When they go into battle without it, they frequently lose. The narrative of the conquest of Canaan in the book of Joshua makes the ark's military role explicit. The ark leads the crossing of the Jordan River, and the waters stop flowing while it is in the riverbed. The ark is carried around the walls of Jericho 7 times, and the walls collapse. The ark's presence is not merely symbolic encouragement. It appears to be, in the text's understanding, the actual cause of what happens. When the Philistines capture the ark after the Battle of Aphek, one of the most catastrophic defeats in Israelite history, in which 30,000 Israelite soldiers are killed and the 2 sons of Eli the priest die, they bring it to their city of Ashdod and place it in the temple of their god Dagon. The next morning, the statue of Dagon has fallen face down before the ark. They set it back up. The following morning, Dagon has fallen again, this time with his head and hands broken off and lying on the threshold. And then the people of Ashdod begin experiencing an outbreak of tumors, painful, disfiguring swellings that the biblical text associates with the presence of the ark. The Philistines move the ark to the city of Gath. Gath breaks out in tumors. They move it to Ekron. Ekron panics and sends the ark back to Israel. The ark does not need an army to defend itself. Whatever it is quite capable of defending itself. Before we get to where the ark went, we need to spend more time with what it did, because the full picture of the ark's activity in the biblical narrative is more extraordinary than most people realize. And the details matter for understanding both the historical mystery and the theological significance. The ark's role in the conquest of Canaan under Joshua is one of the most militarily specific accounts in the entire Hebrew Bible. Before the Israelites cross the Jordan River, Joshua instructs the priests to carry the ark into the water. The moment the feet of the priests carrying the ark touch the river's edge, the waters stop flowing upstream. The water piles up in a heap, and downstream, the riverbed is dry all the way to the Dead Sea. The entire nation of Israel crosses on dry ground, while the priests carrying the ark stand in the middle of the dry riverbed until every Israelite has crossed. This is a deliberate echo of the crossing of the Red Sea, God parting water to allow Israel to cross, but the mechanism is different. At the Red Sea, Moses stretches out his hand, and a wind blows all night. At the Jordan, the ark enters the water. The ark is the operative element. The ark causes the water to stop. This pattern repeats throughout the conquest. At Jericho, the most militarily fortified city in Canaan, the strategy is not a siege or a frontal assault. The ark is carried around the walls of the city once a day for 6 days, accompanied by 7 priests blowing ram's horn trumpets. On the 7th day, the procession goes around the walls 7 times. On the 7th circuit, the priests blow a long blast on the trumpets. The people shout, and the walls of Jericho fall flat. Every person in Jericho is then killed except for Rahab and her household. The military strategy of Jericho is, if taken literally, a technology demonstration. The ark, combined with the specific acoustic properties of the trumpets and the shout of the people, produces a structural failure in the walls. Whether you understand this as a miracle God acting through the ark to fulfill his promise to give Israel the land, or as something else, the narrative is consistent. The ark is not a symbol in these accounts. It is a weapon that operates according to specific procedures, that produces specific effects, and that fails to produce those effects when the procedures are not followed. The first military defeat in the conquest at the city of Ai comes after the sin of Achan, a soldier who took forbidden spoils from Jericho. Israel sends a small force against Ai, assuming easy victory, and is routed. The defeat is attributed not to the military strength of Ai, but to the fact that God's presence has withdrawn from the camp because of Achan's sin. Once Achan is identified and executed, the ark's power is restored and Ai falls easily. The ark's effectiveness is conditional. It requires the community around it to maintain a certain moral and ritual state. When that state is compromised, the ark's power, whatever that power is, does not function as expected. This is consistent with a theological understanding of the ark as the location of divine presence, which withdraws when the conditions for its presence are violated. It is also consistent with a more physical understanding in which the ark's operational parameters require a certain environment, including possibly the moral environment of the community that maintains it. The period of the ark's residence in Shiloh, the city in the hill country of Ephraim, where it was housed for most of the period of the Judges, is one of the less examined periods in the ark's history, but one of the most theologically significant. At Shiloh, the ark sat in a tent sanctuary, the tabernacle, or a later version of it, and the priest Eli and his sons served as its guardians. It was at Shiloh that the young Samuel heard God calling his name in the night. The famous call of Samuel, that is one of the most moving passages in the books of Samuel, in which the boy keeps running to Eli, thinking it is Eli calling him, until Eli realizes it is God, and tells Samuel to say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant hears." The God who spoke from between The cherubim on the ark was still speaking, still present, still communicating through the physical object at the center of the sanctuary. And then came the Battle of Aphek. The Philistines defeated Israel in battle and killed 4,000 men. The elders of Israel decided to bring the ark from Shiloh to the battlefield, reasoning that its presence would turn the tide. The text records that when the ark came into the camp, all Israel gave a great shout so that the earth resounded. The Philistines heard the noise and were afraid. They said, "A god has come into the camp. Who can deliver us from the power of these mighty gods? These are the gods who struck the Egyptians with every sort of plague in the wilderness." The Philistines, in other words, knew exactly what the ark was and what it had done at the Exodus. They knew its military history, and they were terrified, and then they fought anyway, and they won. They killed 30,000 Israelite soldiers. They captured the ark, and Eli's two sons, who had brought the ark to the battlefield in violation of proper priestly procedure, who had been using their priestly office for personal gain, who the text describes as worthless men, were killed. When Eli heard that the ark had been captured, he fell backward off his seat at the city gate, broke his neck, and died. The ark's capture was, in the theological logic of the narrative, not a military defeat of God. It was a judgment on a corrupt priesthood. The ark went where it needed to go. And once it was among the Philistines, it demonstrated that it was perfectly capable of fighting its own battles without an Israelite army. Now, here is where the history becomes fascinating and where the mainstream interpretation begins to look insufficient. For most of the history of biblical interpretation, the ark's extraordinary properties have been understood theologically. The ark is lethal because God is holy, and approaching holiness without proper preparation is inherently dangerous for fallen human beings. This interpretation is internally consistent and has sustained the faith of millions of people, but it does not explain the specifics. It does not explain why the ark kills by proximity and by touch rather than by the moral state of the person touching it. Uzzah was not a bad man. He was trying to prevent the ark from falling. He died anyway. It does not explain why the ark produces the same effects, the tumors, the deaths among the Philistines, who do not worship the God of Israel, and whose approach to the ark is not governed by Israelite ritual law at all. If the danger of the ark is about the holiness of the God it represents and the ritual purity required to approach that holiness, why does it affect Philistines the same way it affects Israelites who violate the protocols? The Philistines do not know the protocols. They cannot be said to be violating them. And yet, the effect is the same. In the 1990s, several scientists and historians began looking at the biblical description of the ark with different questions. Not theological questions, physical ones. What kind of object, built from the materials and to the specifications described in Exodus, would produce the effects described in the surrounding narratives? The physicist David Kaufman argued in a series of papers that the ark, as described, a gold-lined wooden box with gold figures on top in the dry air of the ancient Near East, handled repeatedly by people generating static electricity through their clothing and movement, could have accumulated an electrostatic charge significant enough to be lethal under certain conditions. The gold lining of the interior and exterior, the gold mercy seat, the gold cherubim, all connected, would have formed a capacitor of sorts, capable of storing and releasing electrical energy. The deaths by touch, the deaths by proximity, even, arguably, the deaths by looking inside, if the act of opening the ark released a stored charge through the metal fittings. This hypothesis is speculative. It cannot be proven. The ark does not exist for testing. But the hypothesis is not absurd, and the fact that it produces a coherent physical mechanism for effects the biblical text describes as real and as having consistent rules should give any reader pause. Because the biblical text itself does not attribute the deaths around the ark solely to divine punishment for ritual violation. It attributes some of them, particularly Uzzah's death, to something the text calls error or inadvertence, not moral failing, but violation of a physical protocol. The poles through the rings, never removed. The Levites carrying it on their shoulders, never placing it on a cart. These are not merely ritual requirements, they are insulation requirements. They specify a carrying method that would prevent human hands from making direct contact with the gold-covered surface of the ark. They specify a transportation method that would not jostle or shake the ark as a cart on rough ground would jostle and shake it. When David transports the ark on a cart instead of on poles on shoulders, violating the Exodus specifications, and the cart jolts on uneven ground, and Uzzah grabs the gold surface to steady it, the result, in the physical hypothesis, is a discharge of stored electrical energy through the first available conductor, which is Uzzah. The question of where the ark went where it is now, if it still exists, is one of the most enduring mysteries in the history of religion. The biblical narrative follows the ark with great attention through the period of the Exodus, the conquest of Canaan, and the early monarchy. David brings it to Jerusalem. Solomon builds the temple and installs the ark in the Holy of Holies, the innermost chamber of the temple, separated from the rest of the sanctuary by a thick veil, accessible only to the high priest on Yom Kippur. And then, at some point in the history of the monarchy, the ark disappears from the narrative. The last clear reference to the ark being in its proper place in the temple appears in 2 Chronicles, and the account of the Passover celebrated by King Josiah in the late 7th century BCE, and then silence. When the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar destroy the temple in 586 BCE and carry the temple treasures back to Babylon, the books of Kings and Chronicles provide detailed lists of what was taken. The lists are extraordinarily specific. They mention gold and silver, vessels, pillars, basins, pots, shovels, snuffers, bowls, spoons, every piece of metal that could be identified and valued. The ark is not on the list. The most important object in the temple, the object so sacred that only one person could approach it once a year, is not mentioned among the spoils of the Babylonian conquest, which means one of three things. The ark was not in the temple when the Babylonians arrived, or the Babylonians found it and did not include it in the record for reasons we do not understand. Or the biblical account of the Babylonian spoils is not complete. Each possibility opens a different line of historical inquiry. The first possibility, that the ark had been removed from the temple before the Babylonian conquest, has generated the most theories and the most genuinely interesting historical research. Several passages in the later books of the Hebrew Bible suggest that the religious reforms of King Josiah, who centralized worship in Jerusalem and purged the temple of foreign religious objects, may have involved moving the ark. 2 Chronicles 35 records Josiah instructing the Levites to put the holy ark in the house that Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, built. This has been read by some scholars as evidence that the ark had been removed from the temple, possibly during the reigns of the corrupt kings who preceded Josiah, and that Josiah was ordering its return. If so, the ark was moved at some point during the period of the divided monarchy. Where it went during that movement, and whether it returned, and whether it was then hidden again before the Babylonian conquest, these are questions the text does not answer. The most dramatic and most historically controversial theory about where the ark went is the Ethiopian theory. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, whose relationship to ancient Israel we have touched on in the context of the Book of Enoch, claims to possess the original Ark of the Covenant. They say it is kept in a chapel in the town of Aksum, the ancient capital of the Aksumite Empire, under the permanent guardianship of a single monk whose sole function in life is to guard the ark and who is never permitted to leave the chapel grounds. The monk is appointed for life. When he dies, another is appointed. The ark is never displayed, never shown to anyone, never verified by outside observers. The guardian monk, by long tradition, will not confirm or deny what the chapel contains to any outside questioner. The Ethiopian claim rests on a tradition recorded in the 14th century Ethiopian national epic called the Kebra Nagast, the Glory of Kings, which tells the story of the Queen of Sheba's visit to Solomon, their union, the birth of their son Menelik, Menelik's later visit to Jerusalem, and the taking of the ark by Menelik and a group of young Israelite nobles and its transport to Ethiopia, where it has remained ever since. The Kebra Nagast is a 14th century document, but it claims to record traditions far older, and the Ethiopian Orthodox Church has maintained this claim continuously and consistently for centuries. The claim cannot be verified. The monk will not let anyone see what he is guarding, but it also cannot be definitively refuted. And the Ethiopian Orthodox Church's preservation of the Book of Enoch, a text that every other tradition abandoned, suggests that this is a community with genuine deep roots in ancient Israelite religion, not a community that invented its sacred history for purposes of national prestige. There are other theories. The ark was hidden in a chamber beneath the Temple Mount by priests who knew the Babylonians were coming, a theory that has generated decades of archaeological debate about what exactly lies in the tunnel systems and chambers beneath. The most contested piece of real estate in the world. The ark was taken to Egypt during the reign of the pharaoh Shishak, who sacked Jerusalem during the reign of Solomon's son Rehoboam, and whose campaign is recorded both in the Bible and in Egyptian records. The ark was hidden by the prophet Jeremiah, who, according to a passage in the Deuterocanonical second book of Maccabees, took the ark and the altar of incense and the tent of meeting and sealed them in a cave on the mountain from which Moses had seen the promised land Mount Nebo in modern Jordan. The passage says that Jeremiah told those who followed him that the place would be unknown until God gathered his people together again and showed mercy. The ark, in this tradition, is waiting, hidden, preserved, waiting for the moment of its revelation.